Hello, thanks for joining us, whether you're watching on TV or online. I'm Farah Nasser. We are waiting to hear the latest update on the COVID-19 situation from Prime Minister Justin Trudeau. He's expected to speak outside Rideau Cottage in about 15 minutes. But we begin today in Nova Scotia, where a rural community is trying to come to terms with insurmountable loss, attempting to grieve while apart, all while grappling with the uncertainty that this pandemic brings to all of us. We are learning more about the 18 innocent lives that were lost in this senseless tragedy. The victims include an RCMP officer who put her life on the line to save others, a family of 3, including a teenager with a gift for music, 2 healthcare workers who worked for the Victorian Order of Nurses, and a couple who both worked as correctional officers. There will be no big memorials. There will be no traditional funerals to mourn the lives lost.
I know what I'm about to say is going to be hard for people to hear, especially when we're going through so much pain at this time. And while we want to mourn victims and come together as communities, we need to do that in a way that does not create an environment for COVID-19 to further spread. I know that the RCMP and the victims' families do and will appreciate the outpouring of support that is coming their way. But we cannot have people gather together as part of showing this support.
Makeshift memorials across the province and across the country are growing, and there'll be a virtual vigil that'll be held this Friday to honor the victims. Also, Queen Elizabeth joining the chorus of voices offering condolences to Nova Scotians grieving this tragic shooting. In a statement released on Twitter, the Queen says, quote, "Prince Philip and I have been deeply saddened by the appalling events in Nova Scotia." She goes on to praise the bravery of the RCMP and other police who responded to the mass shooting, and ends by saying, "My thoughts and prayers are with the people of Nova Scotia and all Canadians at this tragic time." You are looking at the flag at half-staff outside Parliament right now to honor the victims of the Nova Scotia shooting. Again, this is the worst mass shooting in modern Canadian history. Now, while we wait for the Prime Minister, let's focus on COVID-19 and take a look at the latest numbers for you of infections in Canada and also around the world. Globally, there are now more than 2.5 million confirmed cases of coronavirus. South of the border in the States, the numbers continue to rise. Some states are already planning to reopen the economy. America now has almost 800,000 cases. That's more than 4 times the cases anywhere else in the world. And in Canada, more than 1,600 people have lost their lives. And now more than 37,000 people have tested positive for the virus. Taking a look at the numbers province by province, British Columbia is approaching 1,700 confirmed cases. Next door in Alberta, there's more than 2,900 cases. And Quebec, take a look, it remains the Canadian hotspot for infections with almost 20,000 cases. Ontario has close to 12,000 cases, with 551 new cases reported just moments ago. Let's go right to Ottawa. We're going to bring in our Abigail Beeman. She joins us from the Global News Bureau in Ottawa. Abigail, first, what are we expecting the Prime Minister to focus on today?
Good morning. Well, we are expecting the Prime Minister to talk about vulnerable Canadians. There are obviously a huge number of Canadians who fall under that particular umbrella. It's something I've been keeping an eye on. We're talking about homeless Canadians, people with disabilities, seniors, students, a lot of people who could be falling through the cracks with the help that is already on the table, namely the CERB direct benefit. We know that the Prime Minister has already made some adjustments there for people who are now able to apply even if they make some amount of money, a limited amount of money. We also know that the NDP had been pushing for changes that they were able to secure in that final deal that helps for people falling through the cracks, but we'll wait and see exactly what the Prime Minister has on the table. We're also hearing that he will touch on the wage subsidy. That's, of course, the other major financial aid package that would trickle down through employers rather than a direct benefit to Canadians.
People struggling and want to get this information. There's also a technical briefing for reporters, so we'll get a better idea also hopefully this afternoon about how exactly this works. Let me ask you about a conversation that also happened between a top Canadian official and the top doctor at the WHO. Now, this all comes as there are calls for accountability. What was discussed there?
Right. Calls for accountability from all over, the most stark being the American president, Donald Trump, cutting off funding to the World Health Organization. Obviously not something Canada has talked about doing, but we know that the International Development Minister, Karina Gould, had a phone call with the top doctor at the WHO, that's Dr. Tedros. The readout from the Canadian side led with the minister thanking the World Health Organization for their leadership through this crisis, so obviously starting on a positive note. But then there was a shift in language from the Canadian government in terms of statements that they've put out, where it was now saying that Minister Gould and Dr. Tedros on this call agreed to how critical it is to have a post-review of what happened in terms of preparedness, in terms of rollout, in terms of reaction to this pandemic. And again, according to the Canadian readout of the call, Dr. Tedros agreed that the WHO would be accountable and transparent in any kind of review. And of course, important to note as well that we're not talking about any post stage of anything right now. We're still right in the midst of this, but ramping up or a change in language about what we are going to expect from the WHO after we are out of this crisis.
Abigail, let's shift our focus for a minute to Nova Scotia, where we're, of course, learning more about the victims. And there are increased calls there for gun control measures. I know the Prime Minister was asked about that yesterday. He said nothing like that is going to be introduced after we're out of this crisis, the COVID-19 crisis. But then again, Bill Blair was also pressed on this yesterday with no commitment. Where do things stand? Could we see anything like this eventually passed in a virtual parliament?
Right. Well, important to note that this was really a main plank of the Liberal government election campaign when they won a minority government back in the fall. And in their language, they talked about a ban on what they call military-style assault rifles. But there were a whole host of questions about just what they're including in that category, how this would apply, when it's going to roll out. The Prime Minister said that they were on the verge of introducing legislation, and then COVID-19 hit, and no commitment from Bill Blair, the public safety minister, about exactly when that would get off the ground.
Okay, Abigail Beeman, thanks so much. A COVID-19 outbreak at a meatpacking plant in southern Alberta is forcing the facility to temporarily shut down. At least 360 cases of the virus have been identified at the Cargill meatpacking plant, and one death there has been linked to the outbreak. The Cargill plant employs over 2,000 people. Employees began the process of temporary idling the plant on Monday. A company spokesperson is encouraging all employees there to get tested as soon as possible. Meantime, in British Columbia, the province is unveiling details of a potential plan to get kids in that province back in class. BC's top doctor says the province is considering a return to school that could see students back in class on alternating days or just for part of the day. The premier says that if that plan is enacted to get back in school over the next few months, some students will still be learning virtually. We want to shift our focus to Ontario, where there is still no indication that the school here could be extended, despite new modeling data that's showing social distancing, physical distancing, as many people call it, is working. Travis Danraj joins us now from Toronto. He's the Queen's Park Bureau Chief here. And Travis, let's start with the updated data. There's good news and there is bad news. Walk us through it.
Yeah, that's right. So the good news is that it looks as though we are approaching the peak when it comes to community transmission. You mentioned the numbers off the top there. In Ontario right now, there are about 12,000 cases. And what's expected when we see these modeling numbers, when we saw them yesterday, is that there are going to be about 20,000 cases or so. That is far down from what was expected, 80,000, and much less than the 300,000 in a worst case scenario. So it seems as though the public health measures that the Premier and the Minister of Health put into place, and also social distancing, physical distancing, however you want to call it, that is working. But the bad news is that the outbreaks in long-term care facilities, those are still on the increase. We're seeing an upward trend there. And we know that half of the deaths of the 622 odd deaths in the province right now are in long-term care facilities. The Premier has spoken about getting more resources there, but there right now are about 127 outbreaks in these long-term care facilities, and they've really got to get a handle on that, Farah.
And Travis, now let's talk about how the provinces differ, because when we got those slides yesterday, that data, it was another reminder of how different BC looks and Alberta looks to Ontario. And then, of course, we have Quebec. What was the main factor here that people are focused on? Is it testing, the lack of testing we had?
Well, you know that Ontario has had a lot of problems with testing and ramping up testing. We are seeing that go up in the past couple of days, but really at the beginning they struggled and they were only doing about 2,000 tests a day or so. The Premier has said that he wants to see 13,000 tests a day. We're about 9,000 or so right now, but that was one of the struggles that they really dealt with. You know, when the Chief Medical Officer here in Ontario was pressed on this issue when he's compared to other provinces, he says, well, listen, Ontario has the largest population in the country. There are some, you know, it's a very vast province and there are some issues when it comes to that. But certainly the Premier has put this marker of 13,000 tests and he wants to see that happen in the next week or so. So that we will get there, he says. But when it comes to opening up the economy, you know, there's no real timeline in terms of that yet. And that's one of the other big questions that he's getting asked every single day.
Okay, Travis Danaraj, thanks so much. And that is President Trump, as you see, taking the podium. He announced on Twitter late on Monday he's placing a temporary suspension on immigration in the U.S. because of the pandemic. In a tweet, Trump said suspension was because of an attack from the invisible enemy and, quote, a need to protect jobs of our great American citizens. President Trump also added he is going to sign an executive order to enact the suspension. Many critics are accusing him of politicizing the pandemic. And of course, just a reminder, we are taking a look here at Rideau Cottage in Ottawa as we keep our eye out for the Prime Minister, who again is going to be speaking about a relief program, a wage subsidy. That'll be the focus of the remarks today. Let's bring in our chief political correspondent, David Akin. David, one thing he probably will be asked about, it wouldn't be in his remarks, but he'll be asked about the oil prices we saw, which we've never seen before. I mean, overnight, I believe it was minus 37 at one point a barrel, which is pretty alarming. Why is it playing out this way with oil?
Yeah, I laugh because it's just unprecedented. It is unprecedented, historical. On Friday, Farah, if you wanted to, you could buy a barrel of West Texas Intermediate for about $18. And yesterday, the producers would sell you or would give you $37 to take it off their hands. Today, West Texas crude is trading at about $3 or $4 a barrel right now. That's like a 300% increase. It's just bizarro. Here's what's happening. Yesterday was the last day that oil traders were trading May futures. So oil that you are prepared to take in May. And oil producers, people who buy this stuff up, are saying, I got all the oil I can take in May. I don't think I have room to store it. The tanks are full because people just aren't driving. They're not using oil. And so we saw a situation where people who are normally customers of oil saying, can't take it. The problem, most producers, including Canadian producers, we just can't turn the switch off. These plants are so big, so technically complex, a certain amount of oil has to keep coming out of them. And so producers were going, nobody wants our oil. Please, you got to take our oil, get it off our hands. They can't store it at the facilities where it's being produced. They need refiners downstream to store it. And that's why we saw this negative price where producers were paying people further down the stream to take the oil off their hand. Today, oil is in a positive territory, albeit not much. Why? Today's the first day that traders are buying June delivery contracts. And so the thinking is, if you're a buyer of oil, you're thinking, well, by June, I might get rid of some of the oil I've got on hand. By June, I'm going to need more oil for my refinery. How much more? Not much. And that's why the price is down. The bigger picture for Canada is Alberta, Saskatchewan, Newfoundland, and Labrador rely heavily on oil royalties for their provincial budgets. We know that Newfoundland and Labrador is practically broke right now because they don't have that royalties coming in. Alberta was in a deficit position even before the COVID-19 hit. And this just means it's much more tougher for provincial governments. Also tougher for the big Canadian oil producers, the Huskies of the world, the Suncors. And at some point, we need to look at helping them out.
David, we are about to go to the Prime Minister. I think we're about 30 seconds away. But wage subsidy is the big thing we should be looking at today. This will mean more money in Canadians' pockets?
Well, for businesses, and hopefully businesses pass it on to employees. Here's what we know. As of April 27th, businesses can, and large or small, nonprofit, doesn't matter, to the federal government to have 75% of the wages of their employees paid by the government. Big program.
Okay, we are going to be watching for that. David Akin, thanks so much. Let's take another look right now. This is the door to Rideau Cottage, where the Prime Minister is set to speak. Again, take a listen when you're listening to the Prime Minister speak about this this relief program. We're also going to be learning about what his thoughts on what's happening with oil. Again, David talked about how this is just unprecedented in terms of what we saw when we saw oil go into the negative. So he'll likely be asked about that. It might not be in his prepared remarks. We know he hasn't talked about that quite a bit. And also, he might be asked about this, the gun ban in regards to what's happening in Nova Scotia. We also have learned more about the victims, so he will likely address that. That number has gone up. Yesterday, when he spoke, it was 18. We now know that that number is 19. The other thing you might hear from this view from the Prime Minister is calls for a probe into China's coronavirus response. Now, will Canada take part? We know that the U.S. has been very critical about China's response. We've also heard from a minister from New Zealand saying the same thing. So we will be watching if the Prime Minister speaks about that as well. Again, we've got the 30-second warning, and here's the Prime Minister, Justin Trudeau.
Bonjour tout le monde. Hello everyone. I want to begin by noting Yom HaShoah, Holocaust Remembrance Day. Today we remember the 6 million innocent Jewish men, women and children who were systematically murdered by the Nazis. We also pay tribute to the bravery and resilience of survivors and of all of those who risked their lives to save others during the Holocaust. I
would like to underline Yom HaShoah, the commemorative day for the Holocaust. Today, remember the 6 million men, women, and children, Jewish, that were systematically massacred by the Nazis. We also pay tribute to the courage and the resilience of the survivors and all those who risked their lives to save the lives of others during the Holocaust period.
This morning, I want to again extend my most sincere condolences to the families and friends of the victims of the terrible Nova Scotia attacks. Since yesterday, I've had the chance to speak with Constable Chad Morrison, the RCMP officer who was wounded, as well as Constable Heidi Stevenson's family. On behalf of all Canadians, I thanked them for their service and their sacrifice. Yesterday, when I offered my sympathies to the RCMP officers who support me, I was amazed to see how many of them knew Heidi and had incredibly fond memories of her. They'd worked with her on the musical ride. They remembered her as an extraordinary person. And it really goes to show just how tightly knit not just the RCMP is as a force, but how close we are as a country. Yesterday,
I had the opportunity to mention to the RCMP who are around me that I offered my sympathies, and I was very touched to hear them talk of Heidi. Some of them had served with her, for example, on the carousel, and they outlined how extraordinary a person she was. And it reminds me of the fact that not only is the RCMP closely knit, but we all as a country are connected to each other.
Yesterday afternoon, I visited the Canadian Police and Peace Officers Memorial on Parliament Hill to pay tribute to Constable Stevenson and to recognize the contributions of all law enforcement members to keep us safe. I also spoke to a number of colleagues from Nova Scotia, both past and present, and sought Senator Stan Kutcher's advice, both as a Nova Scotian and as a mental health expert. These calls reinforced what we all know about Nova Scotia, that it's a special place where people stick together and look out for each other. This week, we are all Nova Scotian. The families of the victims can count on the unwavering support not only of their neighbours, but of every single Canadian.
It's now been some weeks that we're asking everybody to follow the directives of health experts to protect your health and that of others. Isolation, social distanciation, and physical distanciation is an adjustment for the majority of us. And for some, the consequences of this pandemic are even deeper than a simple adjustment. The virus had as an effect to aggravate inequalities that already existed in our society. The most vulnerable, like seniors, young people without a home, persons unemployed, and single parents are particularly affected by the COVID-19. At the same time, the number of people who need a helping hand to get through this difficult period has also increased. Well before the pandemic disturbed our lives, charitable organizations were there for our communities. I'm thinking, for example, the PIO that helps young people at risk, or Modesto Saint-Michel that offers cheap meals. And in Papineau and throughout the country, community organizations are an essential resource for our most vulnerable, and their mission during this pandemic has not changed. But people need more support in order to help their increased number of clients. So the government is implementing an emergency fund for community support. This fund will have an envelope of some $350 million to support community organizations and non-profit organizations. Part of the funds will go directly to small independent organizations, and the rest will be provided to them through central organizations like community care, etc. These community organizations can use this money in order to train volunteers, increase home delivery for seniors, or offer transportation services for the handicapped. With this fund, we are providing these organizations more resources to adapt to the realities and the difficulties brought about by the pandemic.
Charities and nonprofit organizations were doing crucial work to help our communities. Their mission has always been to support people in their time of need, and that hasn't changed. But COVID-19 is putting a tremendous amount of pressure on those organizations because more people need help. For example, back in March, one United Way partner in Winnipeg made and distributed 1,475 emergency kits for families, seniors, and homeless people in just 5 days. Organizations have also had to change the way they deliver services because of the rules that everyone has to follow to keep each other safe. Here in Ottawa, there are a number of organizations that are focused on serving isolated seniors. Usually, they have day programs where seniors can socialize, participate in activities, eat well, and maintain a connection to their community. That's no longer possible because of COVID-19. So organizations are now delivering meals and providing support via phone. In Toronto, Tropicana Community Services is now helping vulnerable youth access their COVID-19 benefits. It takes resources to make these kinds of adjustments, resources these groups don't have because they're spread so thin, trying to help as many people as possible. So to support charities and nonprofits in their important work, our government is setting up a $350 million emergency community support fund. A portion of these funds will go directly to smaller, independent frontline organizations, and the rest will flow through national organizations like the United Way, Community Foundations Canada, and the Red Cross that can get funds to local organizations and vulnerable people quickly. This is money for things like training volunteers, increasing at-home deliveries for seniors, or driving people with disabilities to appointments. With this fund, we're giving more resources to charities and nonprofits so they can adapt to the new realities and difficulties brought on by this pandemic. Notre gouvernement a mis en place.
Our government has implemented a three-point plan to protect jobs and help those who have lost their job, as well as supporting small businesses that have cash flow problems. Today, I have some more news about the Canadian emergency wage subsidy that provides eligible employers up to $840 a week per employee in order to allow them to keep their employees on the payroll. We're launching a calculator on the CRA website that allow businesses to determine just what that wage subsidy will cover. Businesses can submit their application as of next Monday, 27 April. Later today, the President of the Treasury Board, Jean-Yves Duclos, will provide more details about the implementation of this program.
Is also helping business owners and entrepreneurs adapt to a new reality with the Canada Emergency Wage Subsidy. This new measure gives qualifying employers up to $847 per employee each week so they can keep people on the payroll. Today, we're launching a new calculator on the CRA website so businesses can determine the amount they can expect to claim through the wage subsidy. Employers will be able to apply as of this Monday, April 27th. Later today, Minister Duclos will be providing more details regarding the rollout of this program. And I want to turn now to some encouraging news on the innovation front. Our Supercluster initiative brings together small, medium-sized, and large companies, academic institutions, and not-for-profit organizations to generate bold ideas and innovate. So a few weeks ago, the Digital Technology Supercluster challenged its network of over 500 firms to come up with solutions to help Canadians get through this pandemic. They received over 300 submissions, and they are now moving forward on a number of key projects. Toronto's DNA Stack is developing a new cloud-based network that allows researchers who are looking to improve our ability to diagnose and treat COVID-19 to share their findings. Another company, FoodX, is working with its partners to develop an e-grocery management system to make sure our healthcare workers, seniors, and others have access to fresh food during this crisis. Canadian innovators are among the best in the world, and it's great to see so many of them use their talents to help our communities. This is yet another example of what we can achieve when we work together as Team Canada. Cette semaine, et au cours des
This week and over the ensuing weeks, you can count on us to continue to find other ways of helping you. We will continue to do our share as you shall also do yours. It's been some 6 weeks now that you have been in isolation at home, that you wash your hands regularly, and that you maintain a social distancing of 2 meters with other persons. A month and a half is a long time, but your efforts are paying off. We see some early positive signs that we're heading in the right direction, and that is mainly due to you. So let us continue to follow the advice of our health experts, and together we'll get there. Thank you.
Thank you, Prime Minister. We'll now go to the phone lines for questions. Just one question, one follow-up. Over to you, Operator.
Thank you. Merci. First question, Christy Kirkup, The Globe and Mail. Line open.
Good morning, Prime Minister. How will you help millions of Canadians who now find themselves without medical benefits during a global pandemic?
We know that the way we get through this particular crisis is by pulling together and making sure those who are most vulnerable get the support they need to stay healthy, to stay isolated, and get through this. That's key, not just to remain true to our values in protecting people, including the most vulnerable, but it's also key to being able to recover quickly once we're through this pandemic. That's why we continue to work with partners across the country to highlight gaps and challenges and things we need to do more to help people afford cost of living that is in many cases going up because of this crisis. We will continue to work with partners to make sure we're getting that help out there. Nous reconnaissons que pendant cette pandémie,
we recognize that during the pandemic, there are many people who are suffering and need help. That is why we have implemented a number of measures that will help many, many people. But we do recognize that there are still people who need more help. That is why we're working with our partners and people throughout the country and the other levels of government in order to help people get through these difficult times and come back stronger after the end of the pandemic.
Millions of Canadians are finding themselves, though, without medical benefits because they have been laid off. And Dr. Eric Hoskins has said that Ottawa could cover the cost of the provinces and territories bringing Canadians into their formularies as an interim step to help. Is this something your government is willing to do?
We're going to continue to work with all sorts of experts and smart folks making recommendations from across the country in different ways to make sure we're doing everything we need to help Canadians through this crisis. We're always looking for more things to do, and we will continue to do the things that need to be done in order to help Canadians.
Thank you. Next question, operator.
Thank you. Merci. Prochaine question, Michel Lamarche.
Next question, Michel Lamarche, TVA News. Good morning. On the wage subsidy, we understand that applications will be received as of next Monday, but can you tell us at what point businesses that will apply will get the money to pay their employees? Well, the reality is that during this crisis, people actually do need almost immediate assistance, and we have to deliver it as quickly as we can. We have recognized that this wage subsidy will take a little while to start the payouts. We're still working on it. Applications will be received as of next Monday, 27 April, and do hope that we will be able to quickly pay out shortly after that. But it will take at least several days after that, and that is why that we have set up measures to provide for credit to companies of all size in order to allow them to get through these difficult times. The money is coming. The online calculator will allow companies to see exactly how much money they're going to get from the federal government under the wage subsidy program in the weeks to come, and therefore they can make the temporary loans necessary to pay people already now.
We recognize the need for support as quickly as possible, and that's why we're working extremely hard to get help out to people. We started with the Canada Emergency Response Benefit, which has now helped over 8 million people across this country and made a significant difference. But we also want people to get other people to get the emergency wage subsidy, which means working with businesses to keep people on the payroll through this so that they can not only retain a job, but have a job to get back quickly to as soon as the economy picks up again. We have announced that on Monday people will be able to register for this online. As of today, however, they can see what the amount they are likely to be able to get through this and be confident in their ability to access credit from banks, from agencies like BDC and EDC to be able to support people right now in this time of need. We're moving as quickly as we can. We move very quickly on the Canada Emergency Response Benefit. We hope to be able to get this help out to businesses to keep employees on their payroll as quickly as possible.
Michel?
A follow-up question, Michel? Mr. Trudeau, what does quickly mean? Will it be as quickly as for the emergency measure, or will it take longer than that? Will it be a week or 2 weeks before money starts flowing? Minister Duclos will be addressing this point precisely shortly, but I can tell you already that people who are working at the Canada Revenue Agency are working very, very hard in order to get the money out the doors as quickly as possible once applications have been received. But yes, it will take some time, but people can know that the money is on the way and therefore shouldn't hesitate to use the credit facilities offered by banks and other institutions like the BDC and the EDC.
Thank you. Merci. Next question, Charlie Pinkerton, iPolitics. Line open.
Good morning, Prime Minister. Yesterday, Public Safety Minister Bill Blair said he intends to introduce stricter gun laws as soon as possible. And you said your government was on the verge of introducing an assault rifle ban before the pandemic caused Parliament to suspend. Will a gun control bill be introduced in the restricted version of Parliament that we see during the pandemic, or will it have to wait until Parliament returns to normal sittings?
Obviously, we are all reeling from the tragedy in Nova Scotia, and our focus right now is on supporting those families as quickly as possible and as well as we possibly can. On gun control legislation, we made strong commitments to move forward with that rapidly. As you mentioned, we were on the verge of bringing it in before Parliament was suspended through COVID-19, and we're now looking at the right way and the right moment to bring it forward. The tragedy in Nova Scotia simply reinforces and underlines how important it is for us to continue to move forward on strengthening gun control in this country, and we will do that at the appropriate time. Okay. The tragedy
in Nova Scotia has pointed out how important it is to continue to advance on firearm control. We had made strong commitments on that point during the election, and we were on the verge of introducing measures in the House to restrict the possession of assault-type weapons in Canada before Parliament was suspended because of COVID-19, and we're now trying to find the appropriate moment to reintroduce this bill, or to introduce this bill in the House. But we will take the time to ensure that it's done properly.
So which of your government's promised gun control measures will it be that it introduces first? Will it be the assault rifle ban or something else, perhaps influenced by what happened over the weekend?
The legislation on the assault rifle ban was almost ready to go when the Parliament suspended. So I expect that'll be the first measures we bring forward. But of course, as we learn more about this terrible, terrible tragedy in Nova Scotia, we will keep reflecting on ways that we need to help Canadians stay safe in their communities, in their homes, and across the country.
Thank you. One more question on the phone, please, operator.
Thank you. Merci. Prochaine question, Mélanie Marquis.
Next question, Mélanie Marquis, La Presse. Good morning, Mr. Trudeau. I'd like to come back to a question that was asked to you yesterday during the question period in the House about 3 planes that were supposed to land in the country loaded with medical equipment originating in China and that came back empty. Could you please give us some details on this? Answer, I received more information that one plane was supposed to bring equipment back for the Government of Canada, another one that did bring equipment for a specific province, equipment ordered by the province. There are very limited time periods that a plane can remain on Chinese territory, and there were unfortunately long delays about moving the merchandise to the airport for loading, and therefore the planes had to take off without having had the cargo loaded aboard. But we continue to work unceasingly in order to bring the necessary medical equipment and deliver it to our people. We received quite a bit of equipment these last some days. We're expecting more in the days ahead, and so far we have been able to respond to provinces' needs at every step. I do understand that it is rather difficult for people working in our healthcare system to hear this kind of news, but we will continue to ensure that we do deliver the necessary equipment.
We have I got more information on the issues around the two planes that landed empty yesterday. One was a Government of Canada charter. The other was chartered by a specific province for one of their orders. There are severe restrictions on the ground in China in terms of how long a plane can actually stay in their airports before having to leave, whether it's full or not. and at the same time, supply lines and truck shipments to the airports are difficult and interrupted by checkpoints and quarantine measures. For the most part, we've been able to navigate through those and ensure that Canada has received the equipment that it needs, but these two airplanes were forced to take off empty. We will continue to work through a very difficult situation to ensure that, as we have been, we make sure that Canadians get, Canadian provinces, Canadian institutions get the equipment that they so desperately need. We're continuing to receive millions of pieces of PPE over the past days. We expect many more over the over the next days and weeks, as well as the Canadian industrial facilities tooling up their ability to deliver PPEs. It's always a challenge to get the PPE into Canada in a time where the global market is very, very competitive for these. But we have managed so far to get the equipment that provinces have asked for, and we will continue to make sure we're prioritizing support for our frontline workers who are going into battle every day against this virus.
So what happened with the equipment? Is it still ours somewhere in a warehouse, or some other country laid their hands on it since we weren't there? And what is the other province where equipment was supposed to be sent? Answer: we will continue to ensure to do a follow-up on our orders in order to receive the equipment that we need, and we will continue to ensure that trips are made, chartered flights set up in order to take delivery of equipment that we need. Now, about the province, I'll let that province itself share that information.
Minister Molly Thomas, CTV National News. I want to ask you a question on behalf of Nick Beaton, who lost his wife, Kristen, from the senseless violence in Nova Scotia this weekend. He just spoke with our chief anchor, Lisa LaFlamme. His wife, Kristen, died. She was a frontline worker, a dedicated nurse, and was also pregnant. And she was forced to reuse her personal protective equipment because there was not enough. So on behalf of Nick, let me ask you this question. Why aren't there enough PPEs for nurses and other healthcare workers, not only in Nova Scotia, but across the country? And where is the supply chain broken, and what are we going to do about it?
Okay. First of all, to Nick and to all the families going through heart-wrenching loss right now, looking for answers, looking for reasons, looking for support. We are there for you, and we will be there for you. Like so many people across the country who are worried about what the next days will bring and what the challenges are facing. Our frontline workers have been worried about the continued availability of personal protection equipment. We've seen a number of provinces talk about possible shortages, a number of days away. We've managed to cover those, but we are in a situation where people are having to make choices to try and stretch out our PPE as long as possible. Different provinces are managing their stockpiles differently. The federal government is there to support provinces in their requests, and until this point have been, up until this point and beyond this point, have been able to respond to the specific requests that provinces have made. At the same time, we have been fighting in a very competitive international environment where everyone is looking for PPE, which is why we've made significant investments in domestic capacity to make the kinds of equipment that is going to keep frontline health workers safe across the country. D'abord, je veux exprimer toutes mes condoléances.
First of all, I'd like to offer my deepest condolences to Nick and all of those who have lost loved ones in this awful, senseless massacre in Nova Scotia. It's an unimaginable situation. We will always be there to support you and all people who suffer in times such as this. Now, with regard to our healthcare workers who are worried about having the necessary personal protective equipment to protect them, provinces manage their own approaches and protocols on the use of this equipment. The federal government will always be there, and it's always been there, to respond to provinces' requests to deliver equipment. And several times we've heard provinces say, oh, we have a 3-day supply before we run out of this or that. In each case, we've managed to avoid shortages, but provinces are taking measures to make equipment more and more available. We're working really hard on the international level in a world that has become very competitive for this in order to procure the necessary medical equipment. We have managed so far to fill all necessary provincial orders, but we do know that we absolutely have to develop a domestic capability of producing this equipment, and that's why I'm so happy to see that a large number of Canadian companies have stood up to make the necessary equipment, and they will be available shortly.
You said there that you've been able to deliver personal protective equipment to what the provinces have needed, but isn't the supply chain broken if a pregnant nurse has to reuse masks and gloves?
These are decisions that are taken by provinces on how they extend and how they require the use of PPE. Different provinces have different burn rates in terms of use of PPE. We have worked as a federal government to ensure that when provinces have made requests of us for more personal protective equipment, we've been able to deliver what was needed. These are things that we're fighting for every single day, and we want everyone to be able to have the equipment they need.
Provinces make their own decisions with regard to the management of their healthcare system and the use of personal protective equipment. Our responsibility at the federal government level is to be there to support provinces in fulfilling their needs, and so far we have mostly been able to answer to the needs. Of course, we have to continue doing everything possible.
Prime Minister, when you were talking about the gun control legislation, you brought up the tragedy in Nova Scotia. I wanted to know if you've been briefed on what kind of gun or guns were used in Nova Scotia. Do we know that they were legal? And based on that, how would your proposed gun control legislation have potentially prevented this shooting?
There is still a tremendous investigation going on by the RCMP right now. There are many, many different sites, many different questions that a lot of people have, and I'm going to trust the RCMP on releasing information as they feel it is important to.
But with regards to the gun control, why are you joining the two?
We have gun control legislation ready to move forward on. We were almost ready to move forward on it a number of weeks ago. We continue to see it as a priority. We had every intention and have every intention of continuing to move forward on it when things restore to order. It did not need or take this tragedy for us to be committed to gun control. We've long been committed to it. This is just another tragic reminder of the fact that we need to do more to keep Canadians safe.
And sorry, just as my follow-up is on the World Health Organization, Ireland had said it's going to quadruple funding for the WHO, and Australia and the UK are calling for an independent investigation into China's handling of the crisis. All of them are Canadian allies. So is Canada going to up our contribution to the WHO, and are we going to be calling for an investigation?
We have been increasing our contribution to the WHO in order to deal with this pandemic. We fund them to the tune of tens of millions of dollars a year. At the same time, we do need to find answers to how this happened, so we understand how to ensure that it never happens again, and that is certainly something Canada is going to be part of. Okay. Nous continuons de contribuer.
We continue contributing to the World Health Organization. This is an important decision, particularly in these times of a pandemic. But certainly, we will have to get the right answers in order better to protect ourselves as a country and as a planet for the next possible pandemics.
Prime Minister, we've seen outbreaks of COVID-19 at meatpacking plants in Alberta. Should Canadians be concerned about the security of their food supply chain, and what more can the government do to protect that supply chain?
We've heard from Canadian beef producers and associations that the priority will be ensuring Canadian supply before they move to exporting. Much of our beef is exported, but right now the priority will be on domestic supply. So we are not at this point anticipating shortages of beef, but prices might go up. We will, of course, be monitoring that very, very carefully. At the same time, we know that it is extremely important to do everything we can to keep Canadians safe, to keep workers in all industries across this country, essential or not, as safe as we possibly can. And I'm pleased to see measures being taken to reflect on how to keep people safe. La réalité, c'est que
the reality is that meat producers in Canada have given priority to delivery to our domestic market. There might be, therefore, reduced exports, but we can be sure that our own supply chain is in beef is sure. There might be a price increase, but we will be monitoring that quite closely. What's important here is to ensure that we are protecting the workers in our essential industries and others from COVID-19. And therefore, we have to take the necessary measures to ensure their safety.
Going to be further support for the oil industry, and beyond that, will there be support for provinces that rely heavily on oil revenues and might need help with their finances, their debt, to recover from this downturn?
Our focus from the beginning has been on helping Canadians, families, workers across this country, and we have put in place significant measures that have an impact on all industries, including the oil industry, with the Canada Emergency Response Benefit and the wage subsidy, which have helped thousands of workers across Alberta, across the oil sector in this country. We've moved forward on other measures as well to help out that sector specifically, and we're always open to working more on helping particular industries or particular areas that need support to get through this COVID-19 crisis. We will continue those discussions. On supporting provinces, we recognize that various provinces are facing real challenges in terms of cash crunches, in terms of liquidity, and our Department of Finance and others are engaged closely with different provinces on challenges that they're facing specifically.
Bonjour, Philippe Vincent-Foisy de Radio-Canada. Tantôt, dans votre discours...
Radio-Canada. Earlier you said that we're seeing some encouraging signs. I was wondering just what those signs are, in your opinion, and on the wage subsidy. Could you assure us that not a single dollar of that money will be going to businesses that have accounts in tax havens? Now, answer, with regard to the encouraging signs, we see that when we look at the curves and the numbers about the spread of COVID-19, there's a reduction in the number of new cases every day. We're still getting new cases, and it's in the increase in several places, but this increase is lesser every day. And therefore, what that means is that we can hope that the measures that we are now implementing are helping people, are producing the right impact. But we will have to continue to keep implementing these preventative measures, because if we give up too quickly, we might end ourselves up in a situation where we have a rapid spread of COVID-19, something that we certainly do not now. In our approach to help businesses, we were always talking about mainly helping workers. We didn't want to judge whether a worker is working for a small independent hardware store or for a large international box grocery outfit. We wanted to ensure that Canadian workers and families that depend on the salaries of these workers get the necessary assistance, which is why we proposed our wage subsidy program, and that we're going ahead also with our emergency support measure. But we're always working to fight against tax haven, tax avoidance, and tax cheating, and we've taken strong measures to get that money and to impose consequences on companies that practice these measures, and we shall continue to do so.
Yeah. As I've said a couple of times, I think there is reason for cautious optimism. We're hearing that from medical officers across the province, across the country, noting that the increase in cases is getting smaller every day in many places, that we're still seeing more cases every day, but fewer than in previous days, which is a sign that our efforts are working. We are continuing to do the right things as a country that is getting this virus under control. However, we need to continue to do those things, because as soon as we loosen up, if we loosen up too quickly or if we're not careful, we could see a return spike of COVID-19 that would be problematic for citizens and for the economic recovery. So we're going to focus on making sure we're doing things very, very carefully, but it is encouraging to see that the things Canadians are doing from coast to coast to coast to help each other out, to stay safe, are working. That's why we need to continue them.
Just pour comprendre sur les paradis fiscaux, je suis pas sûr.
Just to make sure I understand what you said about tax havens, I'm not too sure I understood it, or perhaps you didn't exactly respond to the question. Can you say today that the money, that our taxpayers' money will not help companies that have accounts in tax haven countries? Can you tell us that that will not occur or not? Answer: we are helping workers throughout the country. Someone who's working for a company that has a family that needs that income and that job was lost, they need help. They need to be able to pay for their groceries, pay their rent. And that is the viewpoint that we took in order to help people, whether it be a large company, small company. We are helping the workers that need help. Now, with regard to tax evasion, we will always continue to fight against businesses that choose to do so, to try and get out of paying their fair share of taxes. That is why we invested more than $1 billion in the Canada Revenue Agency to increase the tools that are available to them to find the companies that aren't paying their fair share. Thank you, everybody.
Prime Minister Justin Trudeau with his daily address speaking about wage subsidy, money for charities, gun control legislation, and the supply chain for medical equipment. Let's return back to Abigail Beeman, who is in Ottawa. Abigail, as the Prime Minister was speaking, I looked at the calendar. March 16th was when we first heard about doctors sounding the alarm about PPEs. That's more than a month ago that we've had a PPE shortage, and medical professionals have been asking, where is my equipment? And now we're hearing about empty planes returning to Canada that were meant to be full of personal protective equipment.
It's obviously beyond frustrating for those on the front lines who are having to reuse equipment, having equipment rationed. The Prime Minister is reassuring Canadians that they are managing to stay on top of supply. But when you hear about 2 empty chartered planes making that expensive flight from China only to return with nothing on board, it's obviously, as you point out, incredibly frustrating.
There's 2 financial announcements. One is the money for charities. The other one is the wage subsidy.
That's right. So a new $350 million of funding that will go to both national and local organizations helping the vulnerable, as well as some new details on the wage subsidy. There is now a calculator available online, and businesses can start applying as of this Monday, but no word on when they'll actually get that money.
Also, Abigail, lots of questions about gun control legislation and no firm commitment from the government.
That's right. Exactly. Same as yesterday. We didn't hear any specifics promised by the Prime Minister in terms of when that promised legislation would come. We heard our own Mike LeCouture asking him about specifics there, but nothing yet.
Hey, Abigail Beeman in Ottawa, thank you so much. And just to recap for you at home, the Prime Minister announced companies can apply to the wage subsidy program that begins next Monday. And there's a calculator, as Abigail said, on the CRA website. Trudeau also said the virus has worsened inequalities that already exist in our society, saying the demands on charities is greater than ever. And that's why he announced $350 million for nonprofits and community organizations. We have much more on our website on globalnews.ca. Thanks for watching.
OK. Bonjour et merci de vous être rejoints à nous aujourd'hui. Permettez-moi d'abord d'exprimer mon profond
Hello everyone, thank you for
à
tuning
l'égard
in
des
today.
événements
First,
qui se sont
I would
déroulés
like
en fin de
to
semaine en
extend
Nouvelle-Écosse.
my most sincere
Une telle
condolences to
horreur
those
et
who
une
have
telle
been
haine
impacted
seront
by the
toujours
tragedy in Nova
inexplicables.
Scotia yesterday.
Mais
Such
pour que
violence
ceci ait lieu
is
lorsque
very
les
difficult to
Nouvelle-Écossais font
comprehend.
des sacrifices pour protéger des
Our
vies,
law
des vies
enforcement
humaines,
agents
c'est
sacrifice
inimaginable.
us and
Aux gens
protect
de la
us.
Nouvelle-Écosse, tous les
It
Canadiens
is so difficult
partagent
to
votre
process
deuil.
it when
I'd like to
they
start
are
by
lost.
expressing
All
my
Canadians share
profound
your
shock
condolences.
and sorrow at the events in Nova Scotia over the weekend. This would be a tragedy at any time. But for this to happen now, as Nova Scotians are all making great personal sacrifices to preserve life, is a particular horror and a particular sorrow. To the people of Nova Scotia, all Canadians are with you in your grief. So today, we will hear from Canada's Chief Public Health Officer, Dr. Theresa Tam, the Deputy Chief Public Health Officer, Dr. Howard New, the Minister of Families, Children and Social Development, Ahmed Hussein, et le Président du Conseil du Trésor.
We will also hear from the President of the Treasury Board, Jean-Yves
Dr.
Duclos.
Tam, please.
Hello everyone and bonjour à toutes et à tous.
Hello everyone.
I will start as usual with the latest numbers on COVID-19 in Canada. There are now 37,374 confirmed cases, including 1,728 deaths. We have tested over 565,000 people to date, with around 6.5% of those testing positive. Though we are still a ways off and the path remains uncertain, I know that recovery and what's next is on everyone's mind right now. Canadians are patiently continuing to practice social distancing or physical distancing and staying at home. And this continues to be vitally important. Public health authorities are closely monitoring for continued and stable slowing of the epidemic, while carefully considering approaches to ease public health restrictions when and where this may be possible. But there are some hard truths that haven't changed. The first is that this will be a marathon and we are going to have to plan, pace ourselves, and not take any sharp turns. The second truth is that there are still a lot of unknowns and no 100% proven path before us. To get this right, there will be a need to learn as we go and to evaluate, adjust, and right the course as we take cautious steps. These next steps may sound challenging, but there are things we've learned and things we now know that will keep us safe as we carefully navigate this path forward together. We know that the epidemiology in each jurisdiction is different, so the approaches won't all be the same. We know the timing, types, and range of public health measures will need to be tailored to address the unique challenges and context of the disease in each province and territory. Likewise, additional measures may need to be adopted and maintained to protect vulnerable populations and high-risk settings within jurisdictions. Most importantly, we know that Canadians have demonstrated what has worked to slow the spread of this disease and what has kept our health system from being overwhelmed. There is no doubt that our sacrifices and everyday inconveniences over the past weeks have prevented an explosive outbreak in Canada, like the ones that have overwhelmed healthcare systems in places like Italy, Spain, and New York. What all this tells us is that we can't be too confident. We can't let our guard down, and we can't afford to have any weak points in our system. What we can do is ensure we all work together, stay the course, and work to strengthen supports that meet the needs of our most vulnerable members of society. If we ensure that basic needs are met for everyone, we protect the health of all Canadians. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Tam. Et maintenant, je donne la parole à Dr. Howard New.
We will now hear from Dr. Howard New.
Merci. Bonjour.
Thank you.
Commençons par les
Hello.
plus récents chiffres sur la COVID-19 au
Let's
Canada.
begin with an update
On
on the latest numbers of
dénombre
COVID-19 in Canada. There are now 37,374 confirmed cases, including 1,728 deaths. We have tested over 565,000 people to date, with 6.5% testing positive. Though we are still a ways off and the path remains uncertain, I know that recovery and what's next is on everybody's mind right now. Canadians are patiently continuing to practice physical distancing. Canadians are staying at home. These measures continue to be vitally important. Public health authorities are closely monitoring for continued and stable slowing of the epidemic, while carefully considering approaches to ease public health restrictions when and where this may be possible. But there are some hard truths that have not changed. The first, this will be a marathon. We will have to plan, pace ourselves, and avoid taking any sharp turns. The second, there are still a lot of unknowns. There is no 100% proven path ahead of us. To get this right, there will be a need to learn as we go and to evaluate, adjust, and right the course as we take cautious steps in relaxing public health control measures. These next steps may sound challenging, but there are things that we have learned and things that we now know that will keep us safe as we carefully navigate this path forward together. We know that the epidemiology in each jurisdiction is different, so the approaches won't all be the same. We know that the timing, the types, and the range of public health measures will need to be tailored to address the unique challenges and context of the disease in each province and territory. Likewise, additional measures may need to be adopted and maintained to protect vulnerable populations and to protect high-risk settings within jurisdictions. Most importantly, we know, and Canadians have demonstrated what has worked to slow the spread of this disease. We know what has kept our health system from being overwhelmed. There is no doubt that our sacrifices and everyday inconveniences over the past weeks have prevented an explosive outbreak in Canada. Explosive outbreaks like the ones that overwhelmed healthcare systems in places like Italy, Spain, and New York. What does this tell us? It tells us that we cannot be too confident, that we cannot let our guard down, and that we cannot afford to have any weak points in our system. What we can do is ensure that we all work together, ensure that we stay the course, and that we work to strengthen supports that meet the needs of our most vulnerable members of society. If we ensure that basic needs are met for everyone, we protect the health of all Canadians. Thank you.
Merci, Dr. New.
Thank you, Dr. New.
And now we will hear from our Minister of Families, Children and Social Development, Ahmed Hussein. Ahmed, please.
Thank you very much. Bonjour tout le monde. Canadians know that when they experience personal difficulties as a result of natural disasters, be it wildfires in British Columbia or a tornado right here in Ottawa, or something closer to home like losing a job, that every time countless charities across the country are there to help them. They're there to step up and help them in every way that they can. Canadian charities and non-profits are there to help us in our time of need. Les organismes de bienfaisance sont
Charity organizations are always there to help Canadians in times of need.
The COVID-19 pandemic is bringing real challenges to these really important organizations. At the very time that countless Canadians across the country are relying on these organizations, some for the very first time, Canadian charities and nonprofits are having to deal with extra costs, procuring and obtaining personal protective equipment, increased costs as a result of staffing shortages, other challenges in their communities as a result of getting materials needed to do their work. And to make matters worse, they're also experiencing a dramatic drop in the amount of donations that they usually receive. So at a time when Canadian charities and nonprofit organizations are being asked to do more by Canadians who need their services, they're seeing a drop in donations and a drop in the number of volunteers that they can rely on. And this has a direct impact on vulnerable Canadians, like older Canadians, people with disabilities, racialized Canadians, including Black Canadians, are being significantly impacted by these developments. So our message to Canada's community organizations and charities is that we will support you. At the time that more and more Canadians are calling on you to provide more services for them, we will support you so that you can meet that request, so that you can answer that call. And as the Prime Minister said, we have your back. That is why the Prime Minister announced that we are providing $350 million to support in an emergency fashion to help charities and nonprofit organizations adapt their frontline services to vulnerable Canadians during COVID-19. C'est pourquoi le Premier ministre a annoncé une aide allant jusqu'à
That's why the Prime Minister announced up to $350 million in emergency funding for charity organizations and not-for-profit organizations. These organizations are providing help to Canadians during COVID-19.
Organizations like the United Way Centraide Canada, the Canadian Red Cross and Community Foundations of Canada to ensure charities and nonprofit organizations from across the country are able to provide much-needed support to vulnerable Canadians. And they will be able to do this by flowing the money quickly to everyone, including local community-based organizations that have the relationships, that know the people in their communities who need these services immediately. This money will help groups like those in Eastern Ontario that are working to provide meals to those who cannot leave their homes, who are not able to do that. It could also help organizations such as the Atlantic Compassion Fund or the Vancouver Foundation, which is providing much-needed support to women who are fleeing domestic violence. We know that these are very difficult times for Canadians, but the Government of Canada is working to ensure that those organizations that Canadians are relying on have the resources that they need so that they can continue to help Canadians now and into their future. I want to thank all the organizations, charities, and community leaders, including faith leaders, that have reached out to me and my colleagues over the last number of weeks for their hard work on this and their feedback and their guidance on how to get this right. Lastly, I want to thank the volunteers and the frontline workers, the service providers who are tirelessly working day and night to provide much-needed critical services to our most vulnerable in their homes and in their communities. Thank you so much for everything that you do. Nous sommes là pour vous. Merci beaucoup.
We are here for you. Thank you.
Merci, Ahmed.
Thank you, Ahmed. And now we will hear from the President of the Treasury Board, Jean-Yves Duclos. Go ahead, Jean-Yves.
Bonjour tout le monde.
Thank you,
Hello,
Christian.
everyone. And
Hello,
thank you
everyone.
for joining us here today. The spread of COVID-19 has brought about unprecedented consequences and circumstances for Canadian businesses and workers. Our government is committed to helping Canadian employers support their employees during these very tough times. That is why the Prime Minister, again this morning, has reiterated and announced the introduction of the Canada Emergency Wage Subsidy in order to help businesses support their employees in these very difficult times. Le gouvernement est déterminé à aider les
Our
entreprises canadiennes
government
et
is
leurs
committed to
employés
helping
en ces
Canadian
temps
businesses
difficiles.
and their
Et c'est
employees
pourquoi le
during
Premier
these
ministre
difficult
a
times.
annoncé ce
That's
matin
why
la mise en
this
place
morning
de la
the
subvention
Prime
salariale
Minister
d'urgence du Canada
announced
afin d'aider les
new
entreprises
information
à verser
about
des
the
salaires
Canada
à leurs
Emergency Wage
employés dans
Subsidy,
les
which will help
circonstances difficiles
employers
que nous
pay
vivons
their
présentement.
employees' salaries
The Canada
during the
Emergency Wage
COVID-19
Subsidy
crisis.
is designed to help employers keep and rehire workers amidst the challenges posed by the COVID-19 epidemic. Having the ability to retain staff and rehire people will put employers in the best possible position to resume normal circumstances once circumstances do allow it. The health and wellness of Canadians is also that much better when people have the ability to pay their bills, their rent, and buy food for their families. It is the government's intent to keep as many Canadians working as possible, and the implementation of the Canada Emergency Wage Subsidy is one of the measures in place to support this goal. La subvention salariale d'urgence du Canada fournit une subvention de 75% des salaires pouvant s'élever jusqu'à
$75% of
$847
employees'
par travailleur
salaries.
par
This
semaine
can be up
pour
to
jusqu'à 12 semaines
$847 per
La
worker
subvention
per
est
week
rétroactive au
for up
15
to
mars
a
et les
maximum
demandes
of
vont pouvoir
12
être
weeks.
déposées à
The
partir de lundi
subsidy
prochain,
is
soit
backdated
le
to
27
March
avril.
15th, and businesses
L'Agence
will
du
be
revenu
able
du
to
Canada
apply as of next
administrera
Monday,
la subvention
April
salariale
27th.
d'urgence du Canada
The Canada
au nom du
Revenue
gouvernement du
Agency
Canada.
will administer
L'agence
the wage
verse
subsidy
des paiements
program
de
on behalf of the
prestations
government
à
of
des
Canada.
millions de Canadiens et de
This
propriétaires d'entreprises
program
chaque mois et
will
fournir un accès rapide,
send
efficace et
funds
facile
to
aux entreprises
thousands of
canadiennes
Canadian
et aux
businesses each
contribuables
week.
est au cœur du mandat de l'agence.
The Canada Revenue
Today,
Agency is
the
committed to
Canada
helping
Revenue
workers and
Agency
businesses.
is launching a Canada Emergency Wage Subsidy webpage. The page includes a calculator that will help employers to determine quickly the subsidy amount they can expect to claim based on the information that they enter into the calculator. The government is grateful for the input we have received from many stakeholders during our consultations in the last few weeks. These consultations have led to the efficient and quick launch of the website today. J'ai le plaisir d'informer les Canadiens que l'Agence du revenu du Canada lance aujourd'hui un site web et un calculateur en ligne
That today,
qui va
the
permettre
Canada
aux
Revenue
entreprises
Agency
de
is
prévoir
launching a
et de se
calculator
préparer
on its
au dépôt
website
de leur demande
to
de
help
subvention salariale
employers
d'urgence pour
prepare
aider
for
leurs
their
travailleurs.
application
Nous
to the
remercions
wage
les
subsidy,
représentants
which
des
will help
entreprises
their
et des
employees.
travailleurs pour
We
leur appui
thank business
considérable à la
representatives
préparation de ce site
and
web.
all stakeholders who have helped in
Businesses will be
preparing
able to
this
apply
webpage.
for the Canada Emergency Wage Subsidy as of April 27th. It is expected that 90% of the applications will have been processed by the 5th of May, with direct deposits and checks made and sent soon after. Until then, businesses are invited to update their business account on the Canada Revenue Agency's website. A technical debriefing session will also be offered this afternoon to the media. À partir du lundi 27 avril, les entreprises pourront déposer leur demande de subvention salariale d'urgence.
Their applications for the
On s'attend à ce
Canada
que
Emergency Wage
90%
Subsidy
des
as of
demandes
April
soient traitées
27th.
en date du 5
We
mai
expect
suivant
that
et que les
90% of
remboursements de
applications will have been
salaire
processed
suivent
by
rapidement
May
par la
5th,
suite.
and this
D'ici là,
will
les
quickly be
entreprises
followed
devraient s'assurer de mettre à
by
jour
direct deposits
leur compte
and checks being
d'entreprise
sent out.
sur le site de
Until
l'Agence
then,
de revenu
businesses
du
are
Canada.
invited to update their
Une
profiles
séance
on the
technique
Canada
sera
Revenue
aussi
Agency
offerte cet
website.
après-midi aux
This
médias.
afternoon, there will be a technical
En
briefing
terminant,
for media.
le gouvernement est déterminé à continuer de soutenir les travailleurs
Our
et les
government
entreprises
is
qui
committed
vivent
to
des
continue to
difficultés
support
importantes
businesses
en
and
raison de la
workers
présente
who are
pandémie.
facing
Merci.
unprecedented challenges in the context of the pandemic. Thank you. Thank you, Jean-Yves. And now we are ready to take questions.
As usual, we'll start with 3 questions on the phone avant de prendre les questions dans la salle. 1 question, 1 follow-up. Operator.
Thank you. Please press star 1 at this time if you have a question. Veuillez appuyer sur étoile 1 maintenant pour poser une question. Notre première question vient de Louis-Samuel Perron de La Presse.
Our first question is from Louis-Samuel Perron from La Presse. Question. So there will be a technical briefing. There are currently sound difficulties.
Certainly. Our next question is from Jamie Strachan from CBC. Please go ahead.
Hi, my question is for Dr. Tam. Dr. Tam, your counterpart in the U.S., Dr. Fauci, talked last week about a road back for professional sports games played without any fans in the stands. I'm just wondering, do you think a similar thing could happen in Canada? And can I just get your thoughts on potential return of professional sports in Canada?
So right now, together with all the chief medical officers of health, we are looking at the next phase, if you like. Again, stressing extreme caution in how we have to keep going right now with the measures that we have. We know that population immunity is not going to be high, so that we have to move extremely carefully. I think we will be looking at all different kinds of community settings or activities and providing I think that it has to be a sort of risk-based approach, a risk assessment, and that will include this area. But I think as some of these innovative thinking is coming together, these are some of the ideas. But again, that 2-meter distance and ensuring that we don't spread the illness is extremely important, whichever solution people are going to think of. So absolutely, I think every sector should begin some thinking about how innovative they can be in maintaining that social distance, because we don't have other specific measures to treat or this virus or the vaccine. So any sort of the new normal must take into account of stopping the spread of the virus like we have now. So, I think it's the other perspective I have is just engaging the communities and the sectors that are looking at their own specific situations, because public health can't possibly assess every setting. We can provide guidance as to how you maintain safety and the health and of the population and the clients or the people that they serve.
Jamie, follow up?
Just to be more specific, would you be supportive of games being played in Canada before empty stadiums? Would that be safe in your estimation?
Well, I think together with the other chief medical officers, we have to look at what plans there are with the people who are actually going to be potentially in contact with each other. So I think for sure, crowded conditions, mass gatherings, is not in any of our near future. I think that is sort of pretty evident. As to whether certain activity can be done safely, that needs further assessment.
Thank you, Doctor. Operator, next question, please.
Our next question, notre prochaine question d'Hélène Buzetti, Le Devoir.
Next question, Hélène Buzetti, Le Devoir.
Question is for you. Last Thursday, your predictions were that we would have between 1,200 and 1,600 deaths by today, and in fact we're at 1,700. That's the second time your short-term predictions are off. So my question is, should we still trust them? And more specifically, when you're looking at Quebec, where there are now 54% of all Canadian deaths, are you concerned about the situation? And is there something Quebec is doing wrong that would explain the situation?
So, as we've always said, the modeling is for planning purposes. They're not there to accurately tell you what the numbers are every single day, and every single day that we relook at those projections, they will change depending on the actual cases being reported. So whatever I said several days ago, the 24 hours following that, those projections will already have changed. So I think that's some of the difficulties if you're trying to communicate where we're at. But it is within a similar range of severity, and I think it is a reflection of the population that's most impacted right now in many areas of the country, and those are the seniors and those who are in long-term care homes. So absolutely, this is a reflection, I think, of the actual epidemiology of this illness in Canada. So I think every jurisdiction must do their utmost to enhance infection prevention control in all of those settings. So that's absolutely critical. And I think any model is going to tell you that, that is, what we're doing right now is going to change the trajectory. Those models are very sensitive to what we do today in terms of projecting into the short or further down the road. So, I think everything must be done to change the course, and it is up to everyone who's responding to help do that.
Oh, well, as a follow-up, you haven't really specifically addressed the question of Quebec now that the province, which represents roughly 23% of the population, has 54% of all deaths. How do you explain that? And or should we start to think that maybe Quebec is not doing something right?
Well, I think we do know that many of the cases are linked to long-term care facilities. So I think my answer stays the same. It's not the only jurisdiction. In fact, many provinces have outbreaks related to long-term care facilities, but it is a major challenge in the context of Quebec. And I know that from a public health perspective, they are, escalating and trying to manage that situation.
Thank you, Doctor. Operator, one last question on the phone before we turn to the room.
Thank you. Notre prochaine question est de Mélanie Marquis.
Next question, Mélanie Marquis, La Presse.
Question. Ma première question serait pour Monsieur Duclos.
Thank you. My first question is for Minister Duclos. Minister Duclos,
le calcul quand même assez complexe des subventions salariales.
How will you be calculating the emergency wage subsidy payments for thousands of businesses in the country, and how will you do it quickly? Answer, Minister Duclos, thank you for this question. You are very right that these calculations will be rather complex, and it is urgent. We want to help businesses to maintain their employees and rehire them, and as quickly as possible. What we're announcing today is a new calculator being launched on the CRA website, as well as a whole host of information on the CRA webpage, so that employers and businesses will be ready to apply as of April 27th. Now, I've had a look at this website myself. I think it's very complete. I think it's very informative. I think it will help businesses prepare to file their applications on April 27th, and it will also help businesses make decisions regarding rehiring their employees if they haven't already made these decisions. The Canada Revenue Agency has extraordinary employees. I'm confident that the CRA will be able to get the payments out quickly. As of May 5th, they will be able to pay out the subsidies that have been applied for. Follow-up question.
Dr. Tam or Dr. Arnoux, it's about the mask wearing policy or instructions. Quebec is working on a scenario right now, or on a new scenario for as far as masks go. I wonder if you're involved in these discussions, and if you would make masks mandatory, as they have been declared mandatory for air travel.
So I think I work with all the chief medical officers of health, so any recommendations goes towards that table, the special advisory committee, and it forms a guidance or baseline upon which different jurisdictions will make certain recommendations. For sure, I think having facial covering on our medical mask, if you're not in the healthcare setting, because we've always said, you need to preserve actual personal protective equipment for that circumstance. And masks do not replace all the other important measures that we do know work in terms of physical distancing, hand washing, hygienic measures. But it does form another layer of protection, which is, can be applied when you can't maintain that 2-meter distance. So that is, depending on what setting you're talking about, that is definitely something that can be considered. in the transportation, like on a plane, as one can imagine, that social distancing would be quite challenging, which is why that policy was added. As well, in our Quarantine Act, when we now have mandatory orders for both symptomatic and asymptomatic travelers for isolation or quarantining, quarantine for the 14 days, we also now provide a requirement for the wearing of a mask as people are transferring to their place of quarantine as well.
Thank you, Doctor.
C'est Dr. New. Peut-être je peux répéter la même chose en français. Dr. Tam et moi, on travaille étroitement avec nos
I would like to repeat the answer in French. Dr. Tam and I are working very closely with our counterparts, the chief medical officers of the provinces and territories. Together, we sit on a special advisory committee. Yesterday, Dr. Arruda, the chief medical officer of Quebec, said something that is in line with what Dr. Tam and I have been saying. Wearing a non-medical mask can protect others, but it does not replace proven public health measures such as practicing physical distancing, practicing hand hygiene, and all other hygiene measures. However, in some settings, it is not possible to physical distance. For example, when taking public transit or when grocery shopping. So those are situations in which we can wear a non-medical mask. We must make sure to preserve masks for those who work on the front lines in our healthcare system. And now questions in the...
Question could be mostly for the health minister, but perhaps Minister Freeland or Dr. Tam could also weigh in. So Kristen Beaton was one of the victims in the Nova Scotia shooting. She was also a frontline healthcare worker providing continuing care. Her husband told CTV News this morning that before this tragedy struck their family, they were already living under quite a great deal of stress. She was coming home and very terrified that she would pass on something to her children and her family because she was reusing protective equipment because there was a shortage in Nova Scotia. There was not enough for her and her colleagues. What do you say to the Beaton family and to other frontline healthcare workers when you hear stories like that, that there's not enough PPE to go around?
I'll start, and first of all, obviously, my heart is with Mr. Beaton in this terrible time of loss. I can't even imagine how hard it is and how difficult it is for him as he loses his wife and his soon-to-be child, I understand. And so on the issue of personal protective equipment, I will tell you that the federal government has been supporting provinces and territories to procure equipment, as you know, over the course of the outbreak and pandemic. We've managed to work very well with provinces and territories to fulfill their requests for support around personal protective equipment and other medical devices. It, as you have heard us say many times, has been a very challenging thing to do in the time of a global pandemic where supply chains are disrupted, where all countries are scrambling to try and boost up their capacity to produce PPE, including Canada. I will also say that I know that the provinces have been working very diligently to try and ensure that they're distributing PPE to the hospitals and care facilities. And I will say to Mr. Beaton that we all have to redouble our efforts so that there aren't stories of people that have to reuse masks. There are a number of creative ideas that have come forward from partners around, for example, the sterilization of masks, and we have now approved companies here in Canada that can do that, and there will undoubtedly be even more domestic production and capacity. But I think what it reminds all of us who are the ones trying to facilitate this national response is that we can leave no stone unturned, not at the local level, not at the provincial level, and certainly not at the federal level.
Can do a follow. Is that okay? All right. Is there anything more that can be done in terms of providing greater supplies of protective equipment? Also, I'm thinking about the federal government's potential role in testing, as some provinces, namely Ontario, are having a difficult time meeting up some of the goals they put out for testing and the importance that'll come into play. So for PPE and testing, the federal role.
Well, we all have our eye on testing. It will definitely be part of the strategy that Dr. Tam is working with her colleagues on the next steps in terms of as we emerge from this first wave of illness. Certainly at the federal level, we have tools that we can support the provinces and territories with, and we have been, and namely that's financial resources, that's product, and in this case in testing, it's approval of new testing capacities, for example, and or the equipment that goes along to support that testing. For example, reagent and the chemicals that produce reagent and the domestic ability to manufacture that reagent, and also guidance, how we use those tests in the most efficient way. And in fact, Dr. Tam works on that guidance with her counterparts, and it is constantly under review and being renewed as we both ramp up our capacity and understand better how to really get a good sense of what's happening in the country. I will say again, and it's a similar answer, we can all do better. We can all do more. I know that various provinces and territories have struggled with their capacity to test, and we are always there to support them, whether it's people, whether it's financial resources or equipment. We'll continue to work with the provinces and territories to understand what the particular barriers are in their case in terms of their limitations, and work to provide solutions to alleviate those limitations. Thanks.
Thank you, Minister. Julie?
Julie Van Dusen, CBC. I think it's for Dr. Tam. The U.S. estimates it will need about 300,000 people to do contact tracing, especially as it wants to reopen its economy and trace infections. How many will Canada need, and how is that training going so far?
So contact tracing is pretty much a everyday job for local and provincial public health authorities as well. So they are thinking this through. This is one area that really stress that we need to make sure there's enough capacity to do contact tracing. So, and we have offered our support. There's a number of volunteers and people who signed up to our portal in terms of people who can help. So provinces can draw on those rosters in terms of support for contact tracing. But the numbers are up to individual, even health authorities at the local level, to figure out how much they need and to let us know if they need anything else. But I know that the whole public health system knows that contact tracing is going to be very important as we look towards that next phase.
I'll just add that it is extremely important that we understand the investments that we make in public health, both from a prevention perspective and a public health perspective, are critical to the next steps of whether you call it reopening the economy or moving forward in terms of recovering from the pandemic, that if we don't have local public health capacity, we will be significantly hindered in our abilities. And so we regularly have that conversation with provinces and territories at the health minister's conversation table. It is very important that we continue to redouble our efforts to support public health. And I think Dr. Tam is completely accurate when she says that public health is local, that this is something that happens at the municipal level, that is often funded provincially, but facilitated at the local level in partnership with municipalities.
And in a sign that contact tracing is something we're all focused on, I'll just add one thing, which is I had a good conversation with Premier Ford this morning. We talked about the significant progress that Ontario has made in testing and the big difference that that is making. And we also talked about contact tracing and how essential, as your question underscores, Julie, how essential contact tracing is today and also going forward. And we talked about being very good at communicating with each other and being sure that if there is anything that Ontario needs in terms of support on contact tracing, we will all be ready to provide it.
Okay, great. The next question is about the meatpacking plants. So I'm not sure if it's for Patty Haidu, or I'm not sure. So we know the union sounded the alarm a week ago when there were 38 cases at the Cargill plant. Now there's 484. So somebody dropped the ball. Who's going to make sure these places are safe to work in? And who can tell us if the meat packed in these COVID-filled plants is safe to eat?
Well, thanks, Julie. I'll start with an overview, and then I'm going to turn to Dr. Tam because she's been actively involved on the meat packing plant outbreak and other outbreaks and other food facilities. First of all, it's critically important that every sector realize, and sort of back to earlier comments, that every sector realize that they are going to have to be extremely thoughtful about the measures that they take and put into place to protect their employees, because it's not just a matter of a nice thing to do, it's an actual essential component to ensuring that their industry remains strong and able to continue to provide the services or the goods that they provide. We obviously support industry as well as public sectors and in responses, and Public Health Agency of Canada is and has been working on guidance for a variety of different essential workers, and we're very concerned about outbreaks in the food supply chain. Obviously, this has a critical importance not just to the industry, but to the many Canadians along that chain, but also the Canadians that ultimately end up being consumers of the products that farmers are producing. So we have our eye on this very closely right now, and I will turn to Dr. Tam to talk about the details about that particular plant.
I think the outbreak investigation is very much in the jurisdiction of the province of Alberta, and I know that my counterpart is working very hard with the local health authorities. So I think that we're always there to support if they need any extra, support, in whether it's epidemiologists or others, but they are managing the investigation of this outbreak. And what I would point out is that it's not just the workplace, but also, of course, the social environment of the workers, making sure that they have the support that they need to keep themselves safe and reduce transmission in their home settings, as well as the work settings. I think the details of exactly what happened in terms of the transmission, I think the Alberta Chief Medical Officer will have a much greater detail, but I know that the risk is not just in the plant itself, but it's more sort of perhaps in the families and the households and those contexts. So I think that's sort of really important to clarify. But I think all essential workplaces must have the necessary protocols, administrative protocols, physical and environmental adjustments, and as needed, whether it may be masks or personal protective equipment or others that the workers might need, should they not be able to physical distance or observe some of the other public health measures. So I think those are some of the key aspects. Of course, we provide the guidance, but I think the implementation is never as easy as one sort of have on a piece of paper. So it's the detail of how that would work in those settings. The other thing is the realization that, again, I think testing does play a role, so that if there are cases under certain circumstances, then a much more rapid and detailed testing protocols need to be put in place. So practicing good food safety measures is the key, or everything that we communicate to Canadians every day about hand washing, safe kitchen preparations, cooking any kind of meat appropriately, then it's perfectly safe.
Peut-être je peux répéter quelques mots en français.
I would like to repeat some of that in French.
A dit que c'est vraiment une priorité pour le gouvernement fédéral.
What our minister has said is that food security and the security of our food supply chain in Canada is a very important priority for our government. We are working closely with our counterparts in the provinces and in the territories. And we are also cooperating among federal government government departments here in Ottawa. It's important to have local protocols in place, as Dr. Tam said. From a public health standpoint, we are always able to provide support to provinces and territories. We issue guidelines. We can help provinces and territories ramp up their testing capacity. Now, for employees, there should be safe protocols in place for them, and there should be enough PPE to protect essential workers. There must also be a way of ensuring in our workplaces and also where we live that things are safe. Many workers who work in essential services, for example, in food services, they may be temporary workers, temporary foreign workers. And so we must work with employers to ensure that they have safe accommodations. We must work with employers to ensure that there are protocols for safe quarantine for those who arrive in Canada to work in essential services. We must also ensure that these workers practice physical distancing in their accommodations and in the workplace. This is not always easy. It's a challenge, but we continue to work with our provincial and territorial counterparts to make sure that these protocols are observed.
Thank you, Kelsey Johnson with Reuters. Following up on Julie's questions about the meat plants, Minister Heidi, you are also the minister responsible for CFIA. So I'm wondering, given we've now got several outbreaks in several meat plants, many of which are federally regulated, if CFIA is looking at establishing some type of national protocol for these meat plants so that the decision on whether to shut the plant or not is not left to only being a commercial decision and may be made or determined by Ottawa or somebody else.
Well, as you know, CFIA already has that ability to shut the plant if, in fact, there is, reasons to be concerned about food safety or other practices that might lead to health risk for Canadians. I share the responsibility of CFIA with my counterpart, Minister Bibeau, and we had a conversation last night, actually, about the Cargill meat plant and what we can do industry-wide to better support the sector from a regulatory perspective or from a structural perspective, really, to help support the sector. This is a really, really important conversation, actually, not just obviously for the illness of the workers, which is difficult enough, and in fact, one worker has already died. This is a significant outbreak, but also for the sustainability of the food chain. And so we continue to have those conversations. I know that Minister Bibeau has her eye on what practical supports need to be in place for the industry, and we're going to continue that work in a very quick fashion to make sure that we can understand how best to support not just the plants, but also the farmers behind the plants who are in a very difficult situation now as the capacity to actually process beef is reduced significantly.
And then just to follow up again on the meat situation, earlier this morning, the Prime Minister mentioned that the industry has said that their priority will be the domestic supply and that we export a lot of meat. So I'm wondering, is there any discussion about restricting meat exports to prioritize the domestic sector, but also wondering if there's any conversations about dealing with the capacity shortage about sending cows or cattle to be slaughtered in the U.S. or elsewhere?
So I'm veering into Minister Bibeau's file a bit, and I will defer the details of the answer to Minister Bibeau and encourage you to follow up with her office. But exactly those kinds of considerations are on her mind. Maybe the Deputy Minister has more information, but I think the Prime Minister is obviously the Prime Minister is very focused on the food security for Canadians, and we will ensure that Canadians have enough food to eat. The steps to do that are still under discussion, but that is of the utmost priority for all of us. Do you have anything?
Yeah, no, absolutely. And just to add that Canada is in a really lucky position because we are a major global food producer. That is a very good thing to be at all times, and maybe especially at this time. The food processing industry has been very proactive about being really clear that the priority will be to support and supply Canadian consumers. That is great. And as Minister Heidi has just said, Canadians should take a lot of reassurance from that. In terms of the whole North American supply chain, as I'm sure you know, Kelsey, U.S. food processing plants have also been facing a very similar situation. So this is a shared reality.
Thank you, Deputy Prime Minister. We'll take one question on the phone and then one last question in the room. Operator.
Thank you. Notre prochaine question de Micheline Laflamme de Radio-Canada.
Next question, Micheline Laflamme, Radio-Canada.
Oui, bonjour.
Question.
Est-ce que le gouvernement
Hello.
va réviser le nombre d'immigrants permanents qu'il va
Will the
recevoir
government
cette année, ou du moins,
change the numbers of immigrants that we will welcome this year? Will the COVID-19 crisis have an impact on the number of immigrants we take in Canada? Will it have an impact on permanent residents who already live in Canada?
Thank you for the question. As you know, we always have immigration levels planning every year in consultations with Canadians and the settlement sector. That's exactly it. It's a target. Who lands at the end of the year depends on the choices that people make in terms of actually exercising their option after being selected to arrive in Canada. So that those numbers fluctuate. My understanding is that in the context of COVID-19, that number will certainly be impacted. And my sense is that there will be, of course, a fluctuation in that number. But as I said, the plan remains the same. It's people's choices in terms of when they get that selection, whether they choose to exercise that selection to land in Canada and what year they do that. That impacts the number of people who actually land in Canada as permanent residents.
Micheline, suivi?
Yes, well,
Follow-up
I understand
question.
that, but do you have, like, I understand that, it's an open, you have targets, and it depends on the number of people you have. But as you look at the number that you can receive now, and considering that, often people cannot get their medical test done in their country of origin, and there's less people in the embassy, do you have an idea of maybe the impact that it will have on the number?
My sense is it will have an impact on the number. How severe that impact will be will certainly depend on a number of variables that are difficult to predict at this moment. But certainly, it will have an impact on the number of people who will be able to land in Canada after being selected through our various permanent residency immigration streams.
Thank you, Minister. Mike.
Mr. Duclos, could you repeat a little bit of what you were saying about the new wage subsidy in English?
Yes, with pleasure. So this morning the Prime Minister announced that starting on today, so at this very time, the Canada Revenue Agency is launching a website which is comprising of all sorts of important information that businesses can therefore learn from, and also a calculator that is going to help businesses prepare to submit their application starting April the 27th. So this is going to be very welcome by businesses across Canada, and certainly by workers who are very much interested in their ability to make ends meet, obviously, but know that they can do this through the wage subsidies that we are putting into place. And on May the 5th, so just a few days after the application is being made by businesses on April the 27th, so on May the 5th, we expect 90% of those applications will have been processed, and therefore that payments will start to be sent to businesses so that they can hire and rehire their workers.
Okay, thank you, sir. And I understand this is a process that is happening in weeks instead of months or years usually, but this wage subsidy took a lot longer to pull off than the CERB. So could you give us some insights behind the scenes? What was the difficulties or changes or factors that might have caused that?
Well, this is the most important economic program that the federal government ever designed and certainly ever implemented. Just about 2 weeks ago, less than that, we voted in the House of Commons to have the the authority to put that into place, and the Canada Revenue Agency workers have since then worked very hard to implement that. And the fact that we are able to launch a website today that is going to provide all the information that businesses need to prepare and then to submit their application is very good news for workers and businesses. And the fact that we can rely on the Canada Revenue Agency, a strong agency with a strong technology and most importantly, strong workers to put that wage subsidies into place is great news. The Canada Revenue Agency every month delivers Canada Child Benefit payments to 3.5 million families. It has handled over 8.4 million applications of the Canada Emergency Response Benefits in the last few weeks. So it's a very strong organization, and strength and confidence are key in the current circumstances.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you, Minister. Ceci met fin à la conférence de presse. Merci.
That concludes today's press conference. Thank you.